Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I add my welcome to you to the Observer Conference interview, and of course, special welcome to my guest tonight, Paddy Ashdown. Let's talk about the 2010 general election. Why wasn't the great surge Nick had fully exploited, do you think, by the party?
If we're thinking about the campaign management, I do think we Lib Dems need to have a better last week campaign. I remember Des and I sorting out a last week campaign in '92. By the way, it was a very good last week campaign, just the wrong one. The theory was very good, and in '97 as well. And so we had this tremendous surge for Nick, but the story didn't get new legs in that last week.
I agree.
And whereas there were new legs from Brown in particular, the Labour Party last week campaign was stunning. But I think the majority of the damage was actually done by the fear factor.
The old squeeze.
Well,
you got squeezed in the south by the Tories and by Labour.
On these circumstances, it was more different. I mean, it was different. We were in an economic crisis. You'd just seen, Greece come to the edge of total bankruptcy. You've seen Ireland threatened with the same thing. I mean, people were bloody frightened. Yeah. They're always a bit frightened before elections who we're going to vote for, but this time there was very good reason to be frightened. Whoever we were going to do a deal with, it had to be the full Monty, to use the phrase. So my job was to try and keep the Labour deal alive, and I was working that sector while Nick and his guys and the negotiating team, who were also there, were obviously working with the Tories. Unless we'd have had those two in play, we would not have had any kind of bargaining position. And it was 5 or 6 days. None of us got very much sleep. I remember on one occasion, Monday, I think it was, David Laws came back from negotiating.
Yeah, it was the early Monday morning.
Early Monday morning, came back and said, these guys are a disaster. All the agreement that Gordon has made with Nick that he would stand down to make a Labour coalition a possibility is now reneged on. And I said, look, David, go home, get some sleep, leave this to me. And I rang Tony Blair and said, look, he was in the Middle East. Yeah. I actually rang Cherie first and said, where's Tony? And she said, oh, here's his number, he's in the Middle East. So I rang him up and got him out of bed, and I said, look, Tony, if this is going to work, you've got to get rid of Gordon. And he said, fine, leave it to me. So the following morning, I had a chat with Mandelson, and I had a chat with Ali Campbell, and I had a chat with Andrew Rawnsley, and we all agreed that Gordon had to go, and by the afternoon, he was gone. Yeah. And at that moment, what happened? Whoa, the Tories came back in and said, what more do you want now, guys? And by the way, where they came back in was with AV. Okay, we'll put AV on the table. And if we hadn't have done that, now, having said all that, let's cut to the chase. Yeah. Having said all that, was I emotionally engaged and involved, tired and exhausted, in making the Labour deal work? By the way, at the end, I rang both Blair and Brown and said to them, if this is going to work, you have to get the three candidates standing for the Labour leadership to come out and back it publicly. Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, David Miliband. And all of them refused. And I have to say, the fact, when it became plain that there was only one deal we could do, and that was with the Tories, I was devastated. I was emotionally extremely upset for about an hour or so. And then I went into the parliamentary party meeting, and I walked into the meeting ready to say, primed to say, look, guys, you've done this deal. I'm never going to oppose it. I'll never oppose what you want to do, what our leader wants to do, and what you guys decide on doing. But I'm going home to my garden in Somerset, and I wish you well. And then I read the coalition document in the meeting. Well, I'll tell you what I said in a minute. I said, bloody hell, to myself. And then I stood up in the meeting, in the parliamentary party meeting, and I said, look, I came in here really upset by this. I did not spend 30 years driving the Labour Party out of the West Country to give them an opportunity to come back. I did not see that it's our job to act to help Mr. Cameron reform the Tory party. I know that he wants to be Disraeli, but who wants to be Gladstone? I didn't spend all my time, fighting the Tories to now do a deal with them. But I've looked at this coalition document, and my response is, fuck it.
Everybody agrees, including the outgoing Labour government, the deficit needs to be cut. The difference is where you had a go carefully policy, which was closer to Labour's position during the election campaign. You have now addressed a Tory position, which is cut deeper and quicker.
No, I'm
so
sorry.
on the most significant economic call of the lot.
Yeah.
The Lib Dems have stood on their heads, and that's why
No, we
quite
had
a lot
not.
of people are angry.
Excuse me, we had not stood on our heads. If you listen, who was the first person to use, we are going to have to take very tough, even savage decisions at the end of this? Nick Clegg. Who was the person during the election who said very clearly, I will rule nothing out. It's going to be very difficult. It was Vince Cable. The idea that we've somehow reversed our position is nonsense.
At this
Well,
conference 12 months ago, Nick Clegg said the Tory policy on the cuts is madness.
Yes, but hang on a second. That was before the economic crisis hit us in the form that it did in the last weeks.
You mean Greece?
With Greece and Ireland and that terrible sort of skittles that was then threatening us. The world was at the edge of a financial crisis that none of us had ever experienced.
No, it's true.
before.
Greece happened
Now,
about
hang
a month
on,
before
hang on.
the election.
Yeah,
So,
but
you
all of
changed your mind at that point.
Well, that was at that point that both Nick and Vince were saying, we rule nothing out.
Well, they didn't tell the voters we've now embraced the Tory position, did they, during the campaign?
I'm sorry, they were the ones who were saying it's going to be much tougher than you think. No, I do not accept the case that we have changed our position from the elections. Actually, during the elections, we risked, and by the way, both Labour and Tory used this as political ammunition. We were not prepared to say we would ring-fence the NHS. We were not prepared to say we would, that these cuts weren't going to be very tough and difficult. We actually projected an honest message to the electorate, and we've held to that. Now, here's the question, and it's a very reasonable question. What is it that how could you subscribe to cuts which put the poor in a difficult position? I cannot promise you, and neither can anybody else, that what's ahead will mean that the poor will be completely immune from the effects of that. But I can promise you this, that because the Liberal Democrats are in this coalition, the principle of fairness will be, I think, at the heart of government decision-making, far more so than would have been the case if Labour had governed or if the Tories had governed.
Tony Blair comes along in 1984. Initially, at least, you and he get on pretty well. I mean, I think it's fair to say you were quite an admirer of Blair, certainly in the early period.
We used to coordinate Prime Minister's questions. We established the target seats. Our aim was to get the Tories out. Yeah. And as this developed, then it became obvious to me that we Liberal Democrats had a huge amount to gain from a relationship which preserved our distinctiveness, but nevertheless could bring into operation, into policy, government policy, some of the things we stood for. And so, I think it would have been derelict of me to have done anything else but to test this proposition and to take risks, including with myself, to bring it about. And although the relationship did not in the end achieve PR for Westminster, it did achieve PR for the first time in British elections.
In Scotland.
In Scotland, in Wales, in European elections. Yeah. It did achieve a Freedom of Information Act. It did achieve devolution that we'd fought for 100 years but had never been brought about. It achieved a very great, it achieved a Bill of Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, incorporated into British law. So, we had stood for a number of things that relationship delivered, even if it didn't deliver the ultimate prize.
You, although discreetly, because of your party's position at the time, but you broadly supported the notion that the Allies should go and topple Saddam Hussein. I think you wrote him a letter saying so, that you didn't say it publicly because you wanted to be loyal to your leadership position, which was different. Do you regret that now?
Well, it was undoubtedly a mistake.
The whole thing was a mistake?
No, I mean, my judgment was a mistake, and I think the party does get it right more often. But I think in the long view of history, it may well be that history will say, because I think Iraq will become an unstable, untidy, chaotic, but nevertheless broadly democratic country. And I think when that happens, it will completely alter the balance of power and the nature of the Middle East, if that happens.
Well, it will be the first Arab democracy.
It will be the first Arab democracy, paradoxically. So I'm not sure in the broad run of history that people will judge that the Iraq War was quite such a failure as we now believe it to be. But the question is, was it legal? In my view, reviewing this from hindsight, in the light of what we now know, no, it was not.
Illegal, you think?
I share the view. I mean, let's say very
Does that mean Tony Blair should be put on trial?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I frankly don't. I mean, I just don't think. You're put on trial for war crimes, it seems to me. On the margin...
Well, war of aggression can be regarded as a crime.
Yeah, it could, but the way but the war crimes normally come about from the way you conduct the war, rather than... It's quite difficult to prove. And look, there are two arguments to this. I think Iraq and Afghanistan are the last time the West will try and do this by themselves.
You touched on Afghanistan, and there was a period where you were very gloomy about the prospect
I am.
of Afghanistan. Are you still, or do you have now a more optimistic view?
No,
of
I'm very
Afghanistan?
gloomy. I think at last we are following the right military strategy, having followed the wrong one for too long. We've understood that in these wars, you don't chase the enemy, you protect the people. And at last we're doing that. We've committed every cardinal sin. One of the lessons of post-conflict intervention is you must involve the neighbors. There's Afghanistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, China, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. Every single one of those countries, including Iran, has a genuine interest in not seeing Afghanistan descend into a vacuum of chaos. And most of them have a genuine interest in ensuring that the jihadis do not triumph. And yet we've involved none of them. The Taliban, in some form or another, will have to play a part in that peace process. I think it will have to be anchored within an international treaty that involves the neighbors, and I think that's the only way out of this with dignity at the moment. Does that mean we should withdraw our troops? No, because we have to keep the pressure on. If you are not able now to do what is necessary to create a negotiated peace in Afghanistan, on the basis that I've discussed, here are the consequences. First of all, Afghanistan descends into civil war. I think that is creating a far greater instability in the world's most unstable region. Secondly, I think Pakistan, they wouldn't necessarily fall, but there's a very high likelihood that the government of Islamabad would fall. I think there's a very high likelihood that you would then see a developing war between India and Pakistan. I think that I can't be certain that when the Islamabad government falls, you'll have jihadi hands near a nuclear weapon, but it makes it much, much, much more likely. And you'll do catastrophic damage to NATO. So those are the downsides of an intemperate withdrawal or a defeat. We have to start setting this thing up for a negotiated withdrawal in which you are thinking about the peace of the people of Afghanistan and the preservation of stability in the area.
I want to thank you all for coming to this Observer Conference interview and thank my guest, Paddy Ashdown. Thank you, Paddy.